First of all, I would like to let everybody know that this call is being recorded. Let's give one more minute, make sure that everybody that's in the waiting room makes it into the call. And for those of you that are in, we've launched the poll. If you could please let us know where you're joining us from. We would love to know. We'd like to get to know our audience today. All right. So before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. I want to welcome everybody. My name is Victoria Matias. I am the Community Coordinator for Texas Health and Environment Alliance, or THEA, the home of CHEJ. We are so excited to have you joining us today on this webinar on community advocacy. So a couple things before we get started. This presentation today will last about 30 minutes and there will be a Q&A session afterwards. But feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. We will be monitoring the chat and we'll do our best to have all of your questions answered. Please do keep your microphones on mute to avoid background noise while the presentation is going on. During the Q&A, you will have an opportunity to open your microphone if you would like to ask a question live. And again, I want to remind everybody, for those that just joined us, that we did launch a poll. We want to get to know our audience. So please let us know where you're joining us today, what state or what country you're joining us from. I would also like to announce our next training webinar, which is going to be a special edition training on September 1st at 12 noon Central Time. And it's Data Centers 101, What Communities Need to Know. Now, without further ado, let's welcome our speaker, Andy Escobar. Andy's pronouns are he, they. He has been with the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience, SEER, since 2021 and currently works as campaigns manager. He was born and raised in Houston on the Jones Road Groundwater Plume Superfund site in a working-class Tejano family. They became a first-generation college graduate from the University of Texas at Austin with 3 bachelor degrees and 3 certificates. He holds over 10 years of facilitation and community organizing experience across progressive movements. Most recently, they helped to co-create the first ever Harris County Climate Justice Plan, which I will drop the link in the chat for you, for anyone who's interested in checking that out. So thank you so much, Andy, for being with us today and giving this presentation to this wonderful network. And I will pass this mic on to you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's see. Can y'all see this okay?
Looks good.
Great. So we're going to talk about community advocacy today, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you all a little bit of some of the learnings that I've gained. And, I know Victoria introduced me, but I'd like to start by kind of sharing a little bit about myself, because I really believe that the personal is political. And for me, this type of work is just deeply into my soul, and it's part of who I am. Like Victoria mentioned, I did grow up on a Superfund site, and it's a Superfund site that I've been working with Thea actually to, clean up and do something about it. But for me, it's important for me to share that because both of my parents have actually survived cancer. And also one of my aunts that lived with us for 16 years has also survived cancer. So I had 3 adults in one household, coincidentally, all have cancer. And we came to realize that our groundwater, the well water that we were all using in my neighborhood, was contaminated, and it was contaminated for over a decade, where a dry cleaners was dumping their chemical residue, and it seeped into our private well water. And so that's something that my family is still dealing with to this day. But it really kind of activated me into taking action into this work. And yeah, this is just a lot about kind of where I come from and who I am and why this work is so important to me. And so here's a little visual of the Jones Road Superfund site. So over here is Forest Valley Drive. That's where my family lives right now to this day. And as you can see, we're inside of this area that has been contaminated. And so I start by sharing this because sometimes for those of us that are dealing with the struggles, it can be hard to get activated into community advocacy. And I think that there's a role for all of us to play, and that's what I want to talk about today. So, a little bit about SEER. So, the group that I work for, we're Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. And we were started after Hurricane Harvey after 2017. We're currently 31 nonprofit organizations, but basically the conservation groups, the environmental advocacy groups, civil rights groups, and everyone in between came together after Hurricane Harvey and realized, wait, this catastrophe has affected and disrupted all of the work that we're doing, and we need to be realistic of how these things are interconnected from the climate and the environment. And so SEER was born to raise awareness of the connections between pollution, place, and the public's health. And we have an 8-point plan that was created as kind of like our North Star for how we approach this work. And we're really excited to share that, Thea's part of our coalition. And it's just been really great to kind of bring folks together, break down the silos, and ensure that everyone is doing what they're good at and recognizing that not one organization can, you know, solve all the problems, but collectively, when we work at our best strengths, we can make a huge difference. So that's some of the beauty of SEER, of being a coalition. And here's a visual of our members. It spans local groups, statewide groups, national groups. And we're really thankful for the ways that everyone shows up and their expertise and their knowledge. So I want to share a little bit about the values that guide our work too, because they really like ground us in community advocacy, right? So the first one is that community residents are experts and lived experience is data. We recognize that innovation requires diversity of thought, and we fundamentally believe that people are more important than profits, that all communities deserve flood protection, nature-based solutions, and we have to look at our history in order to understand our present before we can imagine our future, right? And so some of the work that we do at SEER, we're working on a climate justice program in Northeast Houston, trying to make the connections between how climate change is affecting people's health. We're also running a water justice program, really thinking about bodies of water, systems of water, drinking water, and how we can make that all better. And a regional program where we're really focusing on the areas outside of Houston and Harris County, right? Because we know that pollution and catastrophe doesn't recognize county or municipal boundaries, and so we're all in this together, really trying to build regional solidarity. And then we also have a parks program, right? We know that parks is something that folks of all backgrounds and experiences collectively agree that we want more of. And we have some initiatives. We're working on a resilience center. I'm actually calling in currently from Fifth Ward. We're in the Carl Walker Jr. Multipurpose Center. It's one of our partners, and we're getting ready to prepare this facility to be a resilience hub. And part of that resilience hub is we have a garden that we're working on here, a community garden that we call the Fifth Ward Healing Garden. And we've been doing some financial literacy training. And then the final thing is the Harris County Climate Justice Plan, which is something that I helped to co-create. We became the first county in the country to adopt a climate justice plan. And so that's something that, we're really proud of, and SEER is co-implementing that over the next few years. So thinking about community advocacy in terms of like the environment and climate, I was able to go to a communications boot camp 3 years ago where I learned a lot of this content that I'm sharing with y'all from the Center for Climate Change and Communication at George Mason University. And it's really about how we can be effective with our language and with our messaging and how we talk about these things, because we know that these issues are heavy, they're loaded, and obviously extremely politicized. So when we think about global warming, what are some of the first things that come to your mind when you hear that? It's probably polar bears. Maybe it's Al Gore, right? An inconvenient truth. Perhaps it's the rising carbon emissions that we've noticed, right? It could be catastrophes. That's really true for us here in Houston, with hurricanes and tropical storms. Or it could be, the health of our children and being concerned of air quality for our children, right? Those are some of the common things that people think about historically, right, when we think about global warming. And so there was some data that was conducted, and this is based off of a global context, right? And what's really interesting about this information is looking at who people across the globe trust as, people who have information and access to information. And it's astounding that number one are doctors, right? That healthcare providers across the world hold the most trust in our communities and our, neighborhoods. And second is scientists and teachers, right? And I think it's really interesting to notice how down here, like politicians are at the very bottom, government ministers, executives, right? The folks that we tend to see as holding more power or influence, are really thinking about the people that hold these kind of core jobs and roles in our communities that are doctors, scientists, teachers, police, judges, right? The everyday folks are the ones that we trust, surprisingly. So I think this is really important to kind of ground ourselves in the global context. But when we look at the data for the United States, and this is from 2022, so it's not super outdated, but right, this is a different uh, presidential administration too. But the idea is how much do you trust or distrust the following information as it relates to global warming? And you can see that they have this data from folks across all political ideologies. And then it goes over from liberal Democrats, moderate to conservative Democrats, liberal, moderate Republicans, all the way to conservative Republicans. And just starting with kind of the overall all registered voters, it's really interesting that NASA is number one, right? I think a lot of us grew up kind of really inspired by the capabilities and the innovation that NASA has created, right? Landing us on the moon. And I think it's also because we trust that folks at NASA are the aerospace engineers, they're the scientists that know exactly what they're doing. And so it's really interesting how just like across our culture, we trust NASA. But number two is family and friends, right? And right now, I know that we are in a very kind of hyper partisan culture that makes it harder for us to want to engage with community advocacy. But at the end of the day, we actually have a lot more influence over our family and friends than we realize. And then going over to Democrats, you see number one is climate scientists, environmental organizations, and EPA, and then NASA. Then you jump over to the Republicans, and you see NASA's also won the highest here for the moderate. But then you see family and friends are number one for conservative Republicans, as well as your primary care doctor, right? So I think that this is just kind of the data that really demonstrates to us how influential a lot of us can be, particularly for those of us who are healthcare providers, doctors, primary care doctors, nurses, anyone under that spectrum holds a lot of value and respect in our culture, in our society, and even teachers, right? So I just kind of wanted to share this, and don't worry, I'm going to share these slides afterwards so folks can have access to them. So don't worry about like screenshotting or writing everything down. But this has just been really kind of grounding and sobering as far as like, okay, maybe there is more that we can do to get folks to think about these things. And so when we think about climate change, right, there's 8 distinct ways that it's harming us. And it's air pollution, extreme heat, extreme weather, vector-borne illness, which is also kind of, like thinking about like mosquitoes and diseases that get transmitted. We are dealing with the lettuce outbreak right now. I can't even pronounce it, the cyclospora. So there's a lot of concern about our food. And then there's hunger, malnutrition, and mental health harms, right? That's one of the ones that isn't normally kind of discussed and highlighted. But I think it's also really important to think about when we're thinking about community advocacy. How are people's mental health when we're trying to activate folks? This is kind of like a really good visual to show you, right, how our climate and our environment really disrupt so much of our lives. And Hurricane Harvey for us here in Houston is a prime example. And particularly thinking about, we are one of the health capitals of the country, if not the world, right? We have the Texas Medical Center. And after Hurricane Harvey, there was a lot of disruption with doctors and nurses that maybe didn't necessarily live in the Houston or Harris County area. They lived in the surrounding area, but they couldn't come to work, right? Because they were flooded, roads were blocked out, cars were inoperable, right? It really showed you that the folks that we rely on, that we need, are also everyday folks that get impacted by these issues. And all of our systems can get impacted, right? From school, from work, right? Like, where am I going to send my kids if I, have to stay home or what have you? So really just thinking about how all of these things can affect all different aspects of our lives, but particularly focusing on our health, right? And so it really comes down to our neighborhoods, our social and community connections, the economic instability that it creates as well, right? We know that jobs get paused and people's lives get, put on hold while they're just trying to recover and get through whatever the disaster or disruption is. And so there's 6 key facts when we're thinking about global warming. I'm not going to read them all, but I'm going to say the main ones, right? We know it's real. We know it's us. The experts agree. It's bad. Other people care. And there is hope. That's the good news. And so messaging, right? When we're trying to get folks to kind of get on board with us, the way in which we deliver our messaging makes an impact. It makes a difference, right? And some of the order actually matters as well. And so it starts by identifying what are the health impacts, right? Naming it, whether it's the ones that I named earlier, the airborne pollution, the foodborne diseases, extreme weather. But then it's also identifying a policy solution, right? How do we make that different, make that better? And then lastly, it's invoking a social norm, right? It's sharing that Americans agree that we want our communities and our climate to be healthy and safe, and that many of us are trying to do something about it. We just don't necessarily know how. Right. And so these are ways to persuade people in a very impactful way. And so similarly, right, when we're naming the harms, the health harms, right, one of the 8, we also name who's most at risk, right? We know that it's babies, children, pregnant women, pregnant folks, elders, seniors, people with chronic illnesses and disabilities, people that are low income and communities of color, and outdoor workers. But it's also important because it increases the engagement, right, and how people are thinking about this, particularly among moderate and conservative folks as well. And so 5 policy solutions that we can kind of identify from a community advocacy standpoint is the first one is using clean renewable energy and reducing energy waste. Um, Favoring climate smart foods and really thinking about transforming our farm and food systems, supporting clean and active transportation options, improving our buildings and homes, and improving our community environments. And these are some of the ways that, we're identifying solutions, right? Oftentimes we just focus on the problem, but we don't name a solution. And this is really critical for us to be able to influence folks and get them to understand where we're coming from. And then lastly, it's also really effective to name who our opposition is, right? I know that right now we're at a time where we are naming the extreme wealth inequality, the ultra millionaires, the billionaires, and the trillionaire that we have in our culture, right? But those folks are also connected to fossil fuel CEOs, their lobbyists, the politicians that support them, and the politicians that are corrupt in their pockets. And the reason why this is important is because it strengthens our policy support and the intention to advocate. And it's most effective with Republicans and independents. And it really shows us that, when we're talking about how climate, environment are affecting our health, it's really effective how people are receiving that information. And when I'm talking about receiving that information, right, we often think about kind of telling people what to do. And we know that just psychologically, the human mind has pushback towards that, right? We know that the ways that we can activate people to change behavior and to think about, changing our culture and our policies isn't about telling people what to do. That really decreases the willingness to take personal actions. It decreases the willingness to support pro-climate candidates, and it decreases the trust in climate scientists, right? But our climate and our health have a common enemy. It's the fossil fuels. And so that's something that we can name when we're doing our community advocacy. And so messaging, right? Back to the message. How can we activate people to talk about these things in a way where they're responsive to it, right? And so this messaging that we received from the climate change and health equity folks at the Kresge Foundation, they created this framework and it's rooted in core values. It's designed to appeal to the masses, right? Like a very broad audience, regardless of political affiliation. And it references the disproportionate impacts that are connected to race, ethnicity, but it names the health equity and systems of oppression, right? This isn't a one-stop shop, and it doesn't mean that this is going to work for everyone, but the majority of folks do respond to this messaging. And so it's really important to think about the manner in which we process new information and how we make decisions about what to believe and what to do. And it's determined by our deeply held views and assumptions about how the world works, right? These things are really personal for folks. The core message is really important, right? How are we going to talk about these things in a way that's about us and our health is really important. Naming the problem statements, right? The climate instability, the disproportionate effects on the communities that I named earlier. But the real thing that unites us are these 3 core values. And if there's anything you take from today's session, it's these values that really are universal truths that folks hold dear. The first one I want to name is prosperity, right? We all want to live in a world where we are thriving, where we have access to all of our basic needs, where we have, self-determination, where our families can be happy and healthy. All of that is rooted in prosperity and having all of the opportunities that you need to be able to live your best life. And connection to that is safety. We all want to feel safe. We want to be able to wake up and go outside and not be concerned about the safety of our environment, the safety of our homes, the safety of our communities and where we're at, right? Safety is a shared commun or universal value. And the third one is health equity. And notice it's not health and not equity, it's both health equity. And the reason for that is because we're at a time right now, right, where diversity, equity, and inclusion has become politicized, right? And we know that sometimes when we use those words, people's ears turn off and they'll shut down, right? It'll maybe come out the other ear and won't linger. But when we add the word health to it, health equity, that is something that folks all agree with, right? We all want to be able to have access to good doctors, access to competent, individuals that know the best things for our care and our health and our well-being. And that's about health equity. People want access to good, hospitals and healthcare providers across all parts of our country. And so naming the solution statement, right? Like I said earlier, right? Identifying what we can do to make a difference, but then having a call to action. So here's an example of a call to action for elected officials. It's joining us in making communities safer, healthier, stronger, and less vulnerable to the effects of our climate change so that everyone has an opportunity to thrive, right? There's a way to us to invoke that everyone has a role to play in this. So the order matters, right? We lead with our values, right? Naming prosperity safe, agree with. We're going to define the problem, and then we're going to deliver a relevant call to action. So an example could be, I really value the prosperity of our children and the next generation. Right now, they're exposed to a lot of toxic air quality. And we know that there's higher rates of asthma and respiratory illnesses among young children in these bad air contaminated communities. And so what we need to do is start by collecting data on the air quality and then move towards action on how we can do something about this bad air quality that we know is affecting the prosperity of our future children. And so when we're thinking about what is effective in terms of advocacy for our elected officials, this is data that the American Public Health Association shared. And the number one most effective way to make an influence on your elected officials is to go in person and talk to them, right? But we know that not everyone has the opportunity, the resources, the ability to take a day off and go either to Washington, D.C., right, or to their state capital to meet with those elected officials. But there's other things you can do as well, right? Contacting your representatives, sending out emails, letters, right? There's a lot of ways that we can, try to make an impact on our elected officials. Right, this is just more about like what you can do when we're thinking about democracy, right? Little d democracy, how you can participate, how you can use your voice. It's also about showing up to public events, right? Hearings, testimonies, public hearings, town halls, and raising your voice, sharing your opinion, whether that's through public comments or through opinions and articles, and really working to maintain relationships with folks that are in those political offices as well. So when it comes to our community, right, it's like, oh my gosh, we saw that we do have more of an influence over our family and friends than we realized. And some of that is rooted in our spheres of influence. And this is a sociological concept, but it's really about our ability to make the change on how we're connected with folks and how the influence is. And it's really important for us to understand the layers of our connection so we can make a greater impact, right? So it really starts with ourselves, you, right? Educating yourself on, what you believe in, what are your values, what are your feelings, how do you want to pursue change? And then beyond that, right, the second sphere, it's our interpersonal relationships, our family and friends influencing the people closest to us, right? Then the ring around that, organizational, the social, school, and work relationships, our colleagues, our friends, acquaintances, coworkers, people that we see out in our neighborhood, and then beyond that, right, community with whom we see more infrequently. Maybe it's like the, person who's checking you out at your favorite coffee shop that, you just see every so often, right? There's still community, but you don't really know them, right? You don't know them personally. Then above that, it's government and policy, right? The local, state, national, and global systems. And then outside of that is our society, the internet and culture, social media, mass media, the norms that we have. And sometimes when we want to make change, we'll jump a few rings out, right? We'll be like, you know what, I'm going to go straight to my elected official and I'm going to make sure that, they hear what I have to say. And although we did name, right, that meeting with them, showing up, all of that makes a difference. We have to start with the inner rings as well, right? With ourselves, bringing in our family and friends, bringing in our closer relationships, right? Getting data, getting folks behind us so we can show up to that government meeting and say, hey, I have a petition of 800 people, and we all agree that this is something that we need to do about, right? Then there's like the spectrum of allies, right? How are we going to build power? How are we going to work on this community advocacy? And sometimes we have the wrong idea that in order for us to win, that we have to get everyone on our side. And the good news, y'all, is that the vast majority of people in our culture are neutral, right? They're just living their lives. They're trying to pay their bills. They're trying to raise their families. And they're being pulled in a lot of directions. It's really hard for some people, we know, to care about some of these issues or to take action in a way where, there's solutions that are being identified. Most of our folks are neutral. Sometimes, we have our passive opponents and our active opponents, right? Those are the fossil fuel lobbyists. Those are the people that are like, yeah, burn more coal. We don't need to waste our energy and time on those folks, right? When we've really focused on the people that are neutral or the people that are passive allies, maybe it's your neighbor that's like, oh, yeah, I'll sign that petition. That's fine. What if you ask them to go with you to a town hall or ask them to go with you to go, meet with your elected officials? That's moving them over to an active ally. And so, it's really helpful to think about, moving people from neutral or passive because then we're not as defeated or feeling overwhelmed, right? And we're not kind of going in with this like, oh, like, how am I going to get this person who completely disagrees with me to care about this thing? And it's like, actually, that's not the person you should be focusing on. Um, and right, that's the good news that in most social change campaigns, we don't necessarily have to get our opponents. It's really necessary to move the people in the central one step closer to us. And the way we're going to make more allies that are passive and active is through our spheres of influence. It's through our families, our friends, our colleagues, our workers. It's having those conversations when we feel like comfortable to have them. And then there's power mapping, right? When we want to challenge something, confront an issue, it's really important that we have a strategy, that we get together with these folks that share this same perspective as us. And we think to ourselves, okay, so who's going to be our target? Who in this kind of world that we're talking about is working with us and who is working against us? And how much influence do they have, right? And it's really important that you choose a person, right? And not an institution or an organization, because it's easier to mobilize against a person to get a clear goal accomplished, right? Whether it's moving an elected official to support a bill or to sponsor something on a policy level. And so building the community outreach strategy is crucial, right? When we're doing community outreach, it's targeted communication with a particular group and a goal, right? Successful community or outreach involves knowing exactly who you're reaching and how you're engaging with them. And some of the goals, right? We're going to focus on a particular issue, whether it's, flooding, whether it's our air quality, whether it's cancer in our communities. We got to educate folks on that, right? Here in Fifth Ward, when we were starting a lot of this advocacy, my colleagues were out in the community chatting with folks and saying, hey, have you thought about how climate change is affecting your health? And they're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. What I do know is that cancer has been killing my family and my neighbors, right? And so then we do the work to educate them. Well, that cancer is connected to the environmental and climate quality of your environment. And it's that education piece, that light bulb that goes off. And then naming, okay, so now we need to work towards pushing our elected officials to do something about this, negative health consequences, right? So having something to work towards. and you got to talk to folks, right? And this is all really different amongst generations as well, right? We know that Gen Z and millennials were really active on social media. I always say call, don't call, just text me. And some folks that are Gen X or a little bit older, they grew up with phone calls. They'd rather just get a phone call done and get it over with. And at the same time, there's people that are still, just looking at the news on the TV or reading newspapers or articles, right? So when we're talking about how we reach folks, it's really a little bit of everything. And you're not going to be good at all of them, right? But finding folks that are really good at those phone calls, finding folks that are really good at that door knocking and that messaging and working together to reach people wherever they're at. And the last thing I want to talk about for community advocacy is wellness, right? Sometimes, especially right now, things are heavy. It's tough. Um, and when we're trying to change this really kind of huge, scary thing like climate change and global warming or environmental inequity, pollution, right? We need to focus on our wellness and how we look at our whole selves as people who care about building a better world. And when we focus on our wellness, it's not about pretending that there isn't harm or suffering in the world, but we're focusing on what we have control over and what's directly in front of us, right? Because our brains are not capable of processing all of the information around us. So focusing on something that you can tangibly do something about in terms of your wellness is a really good thing to keep yourself going. And that's care, right? Care looks different for each of us, and it's going to look differently over time. But the idea is that it helps us to be healthy, whole, and connected. And when we integrate care in our community advocacy, folks show up, right? When we serve food, when we have, beverages, when we, have music, joy, childcare, people are more likely to show up because their needs and their care is getting, worked on as well. And I want to end by sharing the 9 dimensions of wellness, because every single human being, to be the best self and to be the best community advocate and to be able to show up, we need to be focusing on these 9 parts of our wellness. And so that's our physical wellness, our emotional wellness, our intellectual, our interpersonal and social, right? We are social beings. We need to stay interconnected. Our cultural and creative, right? Folks need to have the ability to imagine, spiritual, right? We are spiritual beings, and not necessarily just like on a religious context or faith, but being out in nature, connecting, meditating, right? Those are spiritual practices that are good for everybody, regardless of faith. Our environmental wellness, right? Getting out in the nature, our financial wellness, right? We all have to pay our bills, we have practical needs. And then our occupational wellness. Everyone has a purpose and a drive and something that they're good at. And so when we look at the wellness aspects in our community advocacy, we can really promote people to think about where maybe they're missing a little bit of this wellness. How can we integrate it within our advocacy? How can we, maybe offer some Zumba classes for folks, or maybe it's doing some reading groups, right? But really thinking about the dimensions of wellness as a way to call folks into our community advocacy. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Andy. A lot of wonderful, wonderful information. So now we're going to go into the question and answer session. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or if you'd like to come up mute, you can raise your hand. I do have a couple questions from the chat already, so I'll get started with those and give folks a chance to, drop the rest of your questions. So I have two questions coming from Mitch. And one is, in my opinion, another enemy is our protect agencies and public officials that actually approve registration for use of toxic chemicals and approve permits that provide the permissions to discharge and release. Who has oversight and how can we hold them accountable?
The quick answer is we the people, right? And that's more of like a theoretical answer. But at the end of the day, right, when we think about democracy, when we think about who we're electing and folks that are, given access to that public policy, to that, power, we put them there, right? And then when they are then selecting folks for these agencies, for these departments, right? That is a direct result of them being elected by us to do what we ask them to do. And so when they're placing folks that are pro toxic chemicals, pro, more pollution, more fossil fuels, we know that they're not doing what we ask them to do, right? And so it's really part of it is also connecting to everyone on how, well, actually, we need to push them on this because they have to be listening to us. They work for us. And I know that a lot of times that's easier said than done, but it does connect to the accountability piece. And some people don't even realize, right, that some public officials that are appointed or nominated can be replaced, and that we can raise our voices around that.
Very well said, Andy. Thank you so much for that answer. And while I give folks a moment to drop the rest of their questions, I just wanted to, follow up on the second question by Mitch, which was very in the same line. It said most public hearings held by local public officials have limited freedom of speech requirements and are trying to reduce the already 3-minute limited time to 2 minutes, or in some cases, eliminate the public comment sections. So how do we stop local officials from taking those constitutional rights away?
This goes back to the little d in democracy, right? Showing up to city council, to county commissioners, all that stuff is one of those little d democracy actions. There's more, right? There's putting media pressure, right? There's telling stories. There's, you know, doing kind of public campaigns to call these things out, right? So many of us, like I mentioned earlier, we're being pulled in so many directions, right? It's hard for us to care and activate on all of the issues around environment and immigration and wellness and all these things, right? But when we connect to people about, hey, did you realize that this elected official is supporting this expansion of fossil fuels, right? We're connecting more people into understanding what's going on, right? So many of us are, you know, not, I don't want to say the word ignorant, but not capable of being able to keep up with everything. And so by connecting these things outside of just those public hearings and those, meetings and stuff, it's how we activate other people to look at these things, right? It's getting on the news, it's getting in front of cameras and raising our voices so that other people know about what's going on as well.
Thank you so much, Andy. And I see Kimberly opened her microphone. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I can't figure out how to do everything else, but
That's okay.
how do we deal with regulatory agencies that do not do actual testing? I live in the Silicon Forest, and Intel has always given their statistics to DEQ in Oregon. And the current swath of data centers are doing exactly the same thing. We do not know what they're putting out into the environment. They're telling us what they're doing. And I'm not really certain it's entirely truthful.
Valid, totally heard. And I think this also speaks to how we have a lot of distrust in general in our institutions and government officials and these systems that, we have relied on historically. And so I think that's where we turn to other ways of getting that tested, right? It's finding those private companies that folks work at that care about these things and saying, hey, can you get out there and test that soil for us, right? And sometimes there's like, you got to jump through loops and ladders. Like I've heard about stories of people having to like sneak in somewhere to like get that soil or that water tested. But sometimes that's what it takes because we know that the public institutions aren't doing it or they're not being transparent, right? So
Right,
easier said than done, but
right.
finding those private, research studies, maybe even colleges, private colleges, where you have allies, people that think like you and want to see the same transparency as you, and working with them, and then putting that data up against theirs and saying, why is ours showing this and yours is showing that, right? Because data helps mobilize folks, but we also have to have the story to back it up, right?
Right. Yeah, and I've been working to try to illuminate these sorts of things for several years, but at some point you become quote unquote a crazy. I've been working about the lead based fuel that general aviation vehicles uh, use, and the fact that they predominantly have their flight circles around lower income neighborhoods. But we cannot get that kind of we can't get that kind of testing, and it's so diffused that it's difficult to find. But also DEQ is problematic in Oregon. It has been for many years.
I
Uh,
believe it. And if it's bad
we
out
have
there,
a
here in
spill in
Texas,
in Clackamas County that sat there for nigh on to a century, and it didn't get cleaned up until about 5 years ago.
it's egregious, but
It
I think
is. I know, and this is well. I'm taking up way too much of your time, but I appreciate the if there are any resources out there where I might look for those, because we don't have good colleges for that sort of thing. We have liberal arts colleges; they don't tend to do hard science.
we got to push them to then. Maybe it's kind of emphasizing that there's a need for this and there's opportunity to pursue it. But finding those community, academic, and sometimes even there's just like lower level staff that work for these agencies and these officials that do care about these things. And sometimes talking to them on a lower level as well can help mobilize. I see Ken has their
Yeah.
hand up.
Yeah, and I will step in real quick and say, Kimberly, if you are seeking like further assistance with something, feel free to reach out to us at CHEJ and we can, help you navigate some of these issues. I'll drop our email in the chat. And feel free to reach out via email and we can have more of a one-on-one conversation and see how we can best help your community.
Great,
And
thank
let
you.
us know how it goes.
And we have Ken Soling with their hand up.
It's a great
Sorry if I
presentation.
mispronounced that.
Uh, my question has to do with, one of the things that I have been looking into is supply chain of both fuel and food. And if we think about food, today, a lot of us are buying groceries that were harvested, even countries away or miles away. And there's a tremendous amount of energy that's consumed to get that food to our shelves. If we could come up with programs to promote locally grown food, which is probably healthier for you as well, and also on the fuel side of it, if we could harvest energy like in terms of solar and wind, that's coming locally as opposed to transporting the fuel through the Gulf of Hormuz or however far away. So I was wondering if we have some programs to really instill, that kind of mentality and that kind of outlook toward promoting, locally grown food and locally harvested energy.
For me, what it comes down to is like the basics, right? Like we as humans share so much more universal truths, and that's like our basic needs, right? Like we all need clean water, we all need clean air, we need sustenance, calories, food, shelter, right? Healthcare. And by naming the fact that one of our basic needs as humans, food, the thing that's really personal and cultural and beautiful for so many people is something that is directly connected to the harms that we have, it's important so people can think about alternatives, like you said, right? The local options, the more sustainable ways. But I think it's also naming how these systems are at large and then identifying the kind of local ways that we can do something about it. Because you're right, I think the food system is something that kind of gets brushed to the side a lot, especially now when we're really talking about data centers and AI and water. We know that animal agriculture uses a lot of water as well, and that food is causing so much chronic illness in our communities, in our society, right? I think I heard somewhere that for the first time ever, we have more obese children than we do malnourished children on a global scale, right? That speaks to the effects of food and the food systems. And people aren't connecting how fossil fuel industry is connected to our food as well. So I think it starts with that, and then identifying some of those partners, those folks that are on a local level that do care, whether it's like community gardens, food, forests, stuff like that.
Thank you so much, Andy. I have a question from the chat that says, we tend to advocate an all or nothing approach. For example, don't talk to the fossil fuel organizations, but fully embrace the renewables. Can we consider fossil fuel companies and traditional enemies as frenemies based on their incremental environmental improvements? If so, how?
Yes, I completely agree because even with the opposition, right, they're here, right? It's not like we're gonna make these fossil fuel CEOs disappear or what have you, right? And so the practical reality is that we need to work collectively. And for some of these giant institutions and corporations, the fossil fuel companies, it's going to take an incremental approach, right? The transition. And I think that that is something that right, like when I think about like just the workforce as well and like the people that work for some of these companies, there are people that are just, office workers that are, an accounting for these companies that care about these issues, that know that, the organization they work for is having an effect. And a lot of them do have initiatives and programs where they're trying to be more sustainable or more green. And we can criticize that for the greenwashing that it could be, but at the same time, like I think that there is a lot of importance in kind of all hands on deck and recognizing that it's going to take public, private, and individuals, all of us working together to transform, to transition, and that's going to include these corporations as well. And so I'm not a fan of like writing them off entirely either, but it's like identifying who at Shell, who at Chevron that works there also cares about this and is wanting to work together to move things forward, right? In good faith too, right? It's so easier for us to write folks off, but at the end of the day, it's going to take all of us to do something. And that unfortunately also includes our frenemies, right?
Thank you so much, Andy. Do we have any other questions? We still have a few minutes for questions, so please feel free to raise your hand or come off mute or drop your questions in the chat. In the meantime, I have a comment from someone that dropped a resource. They said, if anyone is interested in the movement for constitutional environmental rights in every state constitution that would legally uplift the most basic human rights of clean air, pure water, safe climate, healthy environments, etc., you should check out our green amendments for the generations. And they dropped the link in the chat.
Amazing. I love this comment. So thank you, Lisa. While I think it can be important to call out specific politicians, I find there is more strength in focusing on information and issues. Attacking the messenger who may need to come around to your position may limit your chances of success. Absolutely. And this is where it's like an all hands on deck type of approach, right? Like I know that there are folks that are the rabble rousers that want to go out there on the streets and be disruptive. And we need those folks, but we also need the folks that can talk the talk and walk the walk for some of these folks and, meeting them where they're at, right? But at the end of the day, it's also about like the good faith effort. And if folks are not in good faith meeting us halfway, then it's not worth our time. But for somebody else, it may be. So it's like finding everyone in our network that has the different roles and utilizing them collectively, because you're right, that person holds influence and it's going to have to be a vote eventually. And at the end of the day, humans are not mobilized as much by shame and punishment as they are by, celebration and support and affirmation. So even for the folks that we disagree with, right, it's rooting ourselves in something that is transformational rather than just critical.
Yes, wonderful remarks, Andy. And thank you so much, Lisa, for that comment as well. Right, folks, we have a few more minutes. So if you have any burning questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand, come up mute. We only have a couple more minutes with our wonderful speaker, Andy, today. I will also say to some of your presentation, Andy, connecting what you just said with the aspect of wellness, I think it's super important because how you just said, people aren't as motivated by shame as we sometimes think they are. They're more motivated by celebration. And with wellness, I think there is a place where those two things like interject. We often come together when things are bad, which is amazing, but let's also come together when things are good. We don't always have to get together just to talk about all the toxic waste and all the bad things that are happening. We can also come together and have a meal and do something fun and elevate our spirits so that our cups are full and we can continue to stay in these fights, because it does drain a lot of us, and we need to be caring for each other as humans and as people. So I wanted to connect those two pieces because I thought it was so important in what you said.
And that's exactly it, right? It's human nature, right? We're hardwired to seek out pleasure, to seek out joy, to seek out social connections. And so it's really important for us when we're doing this type of work to have that, to have the funny moments, to laugh, to giggle, to smile, to create, to just be in camaraderie with each other. Because that's how we're going to get the revolution, y'all.
I see lots of thank yous coming in from the chat. And I
I'll
also
definitely.
want to, sorry, I just want to flag that we are going to be emailing the presentation along with the recording. I know there is a handful of participants that joined only with audio. Not sure what happened there. If it's a Zoom setting, we'll definitely take a look to make sure that it's working properly for next time. But if you, for any reason, missed the slides, we will be sharing them along with the recording. And Andy just dropped his email in the chat as well. So you're welcome to contact him as well. And sorry, I'm just looking at go ahead, Andy. I'm just looking at the chat here.
I'm also dropping a link to the Harris County Climate Justice Plan. It's kind of like a website where you can check that out. I want to highlight the themes that we worked around. So it's community, culture, economy, ecology, and infrastructure. And using those 5 themes to think of different actions that transform our county to be more resilient, to be more sustainable, and to be thinking about the next generations to come.
Thank you so much for sharing that resource, Andy. We do have one last question that was dropped over here, and it comes from Veronica. It says, the community of Avenal has a landfill very close to homes, and the community members report nuisance complaints but are feeling complaint fatigue. What would you recommend we do to keep people engaged?
Definitely starting with like, okay, who are they complaining to, and calling out that institution and that entity of like, what's going on here? Why are all of these complaints being ignored or what have you? That's one part. The other part is um, like the complaint fatigue, the research fatigue. Like some people are tired of being asked over and over again to talk about the struggles that they're going through. And so I think it's finding different ways to pivot folks, right? Maybe it's not submitting complaints, but maybe it's helping somebody learn about how to submit complaints, or maybe it's to help somebody understand what the complaints are about, right? Like to monitor things, right? It sometimes we want it to be like an all or nothing, and there really is sort of like a menu of ways that we can engage folks. And it can be as small as like posting something on the internet, sending a text, or it can be as large as, you know, getting a whole action ready. But really thinking about the menu of options that we can provide folks to get engaged so they don't always feel that pressure of like, oh man, I can't show up to that public hearing, but I can do this other thing, right? And so that way we keep folks engaged and we're not just constantly saying, hey, tell us your trauma over and over again, because that is draining for folks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Andy, for that thoughtful response. And it is time for us to log off. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Andy, for this amazing presentation. And thank you, everyone, for your questions, your engagement, and your continuous support of this network. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank y'all.